Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Anne and today I'm giving you my February wrap-up. I did read a little bit more in February than I did in January. I read 5 books, which isn't a lot for me, but I just had a lot of fun reading and I'm really enjoying not focusing on the numbers. This year so far, I will be participating in the Magical Readathon in April, so I'll be a bit more focused on actually reading the books I set out to read, because I want to finish that readathon. But in March I'm still taking it easy. I've just started reading Babel this morning by R.F. Kuang, and I think I'm really going to enjoy that, but it's a big book, so it's probably gonna take me some time. I'm also reading The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, which is wonderful, and I'm just having an all-around great time reading. But without further ado, let's just get into the books. The first book I read in February was Are You Listening by Tillie Walden. This is a graphic novel. I read On a Sunbeam by Tillie Walden a few years ago and absolutely loved that. I gave it 5 stars. And this one, Are You Listening, was another 5-star read for me, because there is something about Tillie Walden's style that's just kind of magical. It's otherworldly. On a Sunbeam was literally otherworldly, but because it was a sci-fi graphic novel, it took place in space. This one does take place in the real world, even though there are some twists and turns that might be a little bit otherworldly. Her art style is really gorgeous. She works with beautiful color palettes, and this one was a little bit darker sometimes because the story is also a little bit darker, but we've got a bit more of a light spread over here. It really drags you in to the story, and I really want to read more by her. But this book tells the story of 2 women, Bee and Lou. Bee is 18 years old, and at the very start of the book we catch her running away from home. She still lives with her mother, but she doesn't want to anymore. She's deeply unhappy. That's definitely noticeable from the very first pages, just from the looks on her face. She's running away, but she doesn't really have a plan. And then she encounters Lou at a rest stop somewhere, and Lou and Bee know each other because Lou is an acquaintance of the family. Lou is a couple years older. I think she's 25 or maybe closer to 30. I'm not entirely sure. I don't think the narrative really mentions it, but I might be wrong. And Lou notices that something is going on with Bee, that she's not telling the truth about traveling to friends in another town, and she decides that she will take Bee along on her road trip, because Lou is on a road trip in her little car with her little caravan. This kind of starts off this story of these 2 women traveling together. They encounter a cat as well. He's on the front cover, and this cat turns out to be very important to the story. It has some fantastical elements to it, but mostly it's just this story of 2 women, 2 young women, trying to come to terms with their own problems. There is some trauma involved in here. Lou has just lost her mother quite recently. There's a lot of sadness to work through, but they find companionship in one another, even though they also fight a lot. It was a sad story, but also a heartwarming story. And what I loved about this in particular is that it doesn't really use a lot of text. The focus is really on the artwork, and the artwork speaks for itself. And the text that it does use is really good. It's wonderful dialogue, really well written, and yeah, I love this book. The next book I finished was 9 Liars by Maureen Johnson, and this is the 4th book in the Truly Devious series, which is a young adult mystery series. The stories revolve around Stevie Bell, who is a bit of an amateur sleuth, and by this point, now that we're at the 4th book, I think she has solved multiple murders, and she has become kind of known for that in some circles as well. She solved the Allingham Academy murder, which was what the first 3 books or the first 2 books were about. I think 9 Liars might even be the 5th book, because the first 3 books were about the Allingham Academy murders, and then there was a separate mystery after that, and then there is this one. So I think it's the 5th book in the series. In this book, Stevie and her friends travel to London, so they go overseas from, I think, Allingham Academy is at Vermont, and they travel overseas to London for a bit of time abroad. They were planning on visiting museums and studying that way, but Stevie is really there to reunite with her boyfriend, and of course she stumbles across a mystery. This is a mystery that took place in the 90s when 9 friends, the 9 liars from the title, were all together at the big estate of one of the friends' parents, and a murder happens. And this murder has gone unsolved for all these years. At least people think it was just burglars, but there are some people who suspect that there was something else going on. And Stevie, of course, gets dragged in to solve this murder. I love a Stevie Bell mystery. I love the first 4 books in the series. Even though the first one was, I think, my least favorite, it took some time to really get going for me, but now I'm completely invested in Stevie and her friends. Stevie has anxiety, which makes her relatable to me, but she's also, I love how she's a flawed character. She has some very flawed reasoning every now and again. She lets herself follow her instincts, which are often running towards danger. She puts everything she does in service of solving these mysteries she becomes involved in. She attracts trouble, basically, which is really fun for a story. She has some great friends that I really enjoy reading about as well. Maureen Johnson's writing style is really wonderful. I really enjoy that. I have listened to all of these books on audio, which works really well. The only problem I had with this audiobook is that the narrator doesn't really know how to do an English accent. And there were quite a few English accents necessary for this book because the friends traveled to London. So that was a little bit of an issue, but it kind of made me laugh. It wasn't really cringeworthy. It was just a bit funny. All in all, I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars. It wasn't the best mystery out of the 3 we've had so far, but it was really a fun read. Next up, I read The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This is a book that I've read so many things about over the years. It's been out for a couple of years, I think, and I've had it on my shelves since 2021, I think. This was a 5-star prediction for me for this year, but unfortunately, I didn't give this 5 stars. I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars, which is not a bad rating, but if you're expecting it to be a 5-star book, it's a bit of a disappointment. The House in the Cerulean Sea tells the story of Linus Baker, and Linus leads a quiet life. He works for the department in charge of magical youth, and he spent many dull years monitoring the orphanages for magical youth. We notice very early on that Linus has become kind of complacent. He doesn't really get emotional. He just goes through the mechanics of his everyday life, even though as a reader you really notice that these orphanages for magical youth are very questionable and quite problematic, and this whole department in charge of magical youth is also kind of awful. But because of that, because of the fact that Linus doesn't really connect with what he does and he is just going through the motions and does the motions very well in the eyes of the Department of Magical Youth, he is tasked to go to an orphanage that houses some very supposedly dangerous magical orphans, among which is the Antichrist. And he needs to monitor what's going on here and eventually report back to the department, who are then going to decide, based on his report, if this orphanage needs to be closed or if it can go on the way that it's going on. This orphanage is located on an island. It is in a very remote location, and Linus there meets the 5, I think, magical children that he needs to monitor, as well as their ward, Arthur Parnassus. And he has a very hard time connecting to these children because he's scared of them and he feels like he needs to keep his distance. But bit by bit, he starts to thaw and he starts to see these children for who they really are, for real people and not just their abilities, and he really starts to form a connection with them, as well as Arthur, who he kind of has a crush on. That's basically the story of The House in the Cerulean Sea. It's a heartwarming story about Linus finding purpose in life again, becoming passionate about something and really connecting to other people. For me, something just didn't fully click. I know a lot of people really love this book because of the heartwarming nature of it, because of the lovely characters, the fun children. The Antichrist is a really fun aspect of this book. It's all just very cozy and warm, but I had a hard time getting on board with Linus as a main character. I know the whole point of the book was that he had a lot of growing to do, but I just found it very difficult to keep reading about how he is just deliberately closing his eyes to all the injustice that is done to these children and to magical people in general in this world. It just made me very angry, and it kept going on for a long time. And I guess he is redeemed at the end, but for me it was just not fun to read about that, about someone who's just so complacent and who just keeps saying that's not part of my job description. That just makes me angry. Also, the injustices that I mentioned are really very awful. There is a lot of hatred in this book, but because it is written in such a warm, cozy way, and it's supposed to be such a heartwarming story, all of this hatred felt very jarring to me. It felt very strange to me to be reading about a fun day out for these children, and then these children getting yelled at by grown people who tell them they don't belong there, that they're atrocities. Like I said, I found that to be quite jarring, and I felt like it wasn't really talked about properly. However, once Linus got a bit more bearable to read about, I did find this story quite enjoyable. I loved the other characters on the island, the children, the magical children. I loved the island itself. I loved Zoe, who is another character that lives there, and Arthur. The writing is quite wonderful, and the last third of the book was really quite lovely. Next up, I read a Dutch book, which isn't something I do very often, but my boyfriend always speaks very highly about this book, and I just felt the urge to pick it up, so I did so. This book is called Wij zijn licht by Gerda Blees, and Wij zijn licht translates directly to We Are Light. This is a very interesting book in terms of narrative structure and just plot as well. It tells the story of a couple of people living together in, I'm not sure what the English word for it called is, a bit too heavy I think, but these are 4 adults living together in a house, and they have kind of stopped eating because they are convinced that food is toxic to the body and that if they want to, they can survive on light. Of course, that is not true, and at the very start of the book, one of the characters dies from starvation, basically, and malnutrition, and the rest of the book revolves around this investigation of trying to figure out whether the other 3 characters are guilty of her death and whether they need to be punished for that, or if they are innocent and free to go, because at the start of the book they are arrested. What makes this book so interesting is that every chapter, and there are 25 of them, is told from a different perspective, and not just human perspectives. There are chapters written from the perspective of a cello, or from a slice of bread, or just from light in general. There are chapters from the perspective of certain concepts. This sounds really out there, but it works really, really well. I gave this 5 stars, by the way, because I loved it. Every chapter is written just a little bit differently in terms of style that really fits that perspective, but all of it still fits together as one whole story with one overarching style, which I thought was really well done. One of the chapters I found most impressive was the chapter that is written from the perspective of dementia, or maybe even Alzheimer's specifically. That was really moving and very beautifully done. So I don't think this is translated into English, but if you do read Dutch, I'd highly recommend this book because it is really great. The last book I finished in February was Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. This is the sequel to Ninth House, which came out a couple of years ago, and it is an adult dark academia fantasy book or series set at Yale University in America. We follow our main character Alex Stern, and Alex has had quite a difficult life up until now. Right before she started to attend Yale, she was part of a group of drug addicts and drug dealers living a life in squalor, basically. So you find out in Ninth House how she went from that to attending Yale. Alex has a special ability. She can see greys, as she calls them. And a grey is basically a ghost, a person who has died and is still roaming around the world. This is quite dangerous for her, but it is also a special ability that nobody really has. So as the story progresses, we find out more about how she uses this to her advantage, how this has affected her throughout her life. And at Yale, she has become part of the Ninth House. The Ninth House is one of the 9 secret societies that Yale has, and all of these secret societies have a certain kind of magic. This is all very dark magic. The story isn't fun and light at all. It has some very dark stuff to it. But I really loved Ninth House. I gave it 5 stars. I did need to read a bit of a recap before starting Hellbent, and even after that I was a bit confused sometimes, because names were mentioned that I didn't really have much recollection of, how these people featured in the previous book. So that was a bit annoying. Maybe I should have reread Ninth House, but it's quite a big book, so I didn't feel like doing that. Hellbent was a tiny bit of a disappointment to me. I still gave it 3.5 stars, but again, that's not the 5 stars that I expected it to be. Where Ninth House was a roller coaster ride that I was on board with from start to finish, that I absolutely loved, Hellbent was still a roller coaster ride from start to finish. It was a wild ride, and it was still enjoyable as well, but it also felt like it was going too fast. There was never a moment of reflection, of peace, of characters just talking through things together, and because of that, a lot of the impact didn't really hit for me. There were a couple of very significant moments in this book that we've been working towards since Ninth House that should have been really impactful, but because they were rushed over so quickly, because so much more plot still needed to happen, and this roller coaster was still going so fast, they didn't really hit, and that was a bit of a disappointment to me. I would have loved to have seen, like I said, a bit more reflection, a bit more downtime. That would also make it easier to connect with the characters. Because everything was so fast, I felt like there was a lot less character development than in the first book. Then again, Leigh Bardugo's writing is still amazing. I had a really good time reading this book. It was just not the amazing read that I had expected it to be. And those were the 5 books I read in February. I hope you enjoyed this video. And I'm sorry if my voice started to sound a bit croaky by the end. I had COVID for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and it really was not a big deal for me. It only manifested as a bit of a cold for a couple of days, but it did leave me with a bit of an itchy throat still. But I really did want to film this video because it's almost halfway through March by now. Anyway, in a comment down below, please let me know what was your favorite book you read in February and if you have any fun reading plans for March. Please like this video if you liked it and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of me in the future. And have a wonderful day. Bye!